The question of the throne, succession, and everything related to it has always been one of the most serious stumbling blocks for both historians and ordinary citizens. Any normal person is interested in who rules them, who gives the orders. Does the person who sends you to risk your life on the battlefield or just collects taxes from you deserve your trust? Is the ruler worthy of fanatical love, or is he an imposter who parasitizes society and simply steals the people's wealth? The question is by no means
an idle one.
And that's why at all times it has also become the subject of speculation, manipulation, and behind-the-scenes schemes aimed at gaining power by some and overthrowing the throne by others. We know plenty of historical examples of such struggles, starting with the French Revolution, the Great October Revolution, the uprising of Minin and Požarsky, Pugachev, the Streltsy uprisings, and so on, and so on, and so on. Yes, even what is happening in the world right now is rooted in distrust of authority, in bloodshed and revolutions. This includes Libya, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, and India, and the division of Korea into two parts. Yes, this list could go on endlessly. That's why the question of the legitimacy of power is one of the most important questions in history. But any rebellion, any revolution, any confrontation always starts small, with a seed of doubt, with a tiny smoldering ember in the minds of the people. And depending on whether someone fans this ember into the fire of revolution or manages to extinguish it at an early stage, that's how the history of the country, the state, the empire, and the whole world will develop further. Until the next ember. Hello everyone, you're on the Epoca Netivoria channel, and today we'll touch on this delicate issue, but from a historical perspective, this episode will be in the Epoca Netivoria format. Against, and as my opponent, I choose my colleague Ilya Gerasimov, who is better known by the name of his channel, Chairman S&T. Let me clarify right away that everything I'm going to talk about applies not only to him personally, but also to a huge number of other bloggers who raise the same questions and from the same perspective as the chairman. As you have already understood, this will be a serious conversation. The fact is that lately this delicate question has been raised more and more often. The question of succession to the throne. Who ruled us? Who continues to rule us? Who are the people who decide whether we live or die? And if we are to die, then for what? So to begin with, let's outline the questions that are regularly raised on the Chairman S&T channel and other channels. And they're not just brought up as a mystery should be, but are actively emphasized from one video to the next. And then we'll try to find answers to them. So the very first question concerns Yekaterina II, or Yekaterina the Great. As Ilya repeatedly says in his videos, he calls things by their proper names, meaning he tells the truth, the reality, which in his opinion is that Yekaterina should be called by her real name, that is, Sophia Augusta Anhalt-Zerbst.
I want to apologize once again to those viewers whose feelings I offend by calling things by their proper names. Well, that is, when I call our Empress Yekaterina the Great, Yekaterina II, Sophia Augusta, Frederica Anhalt-Zerbst, and by doing so say that our emperors were not Russian by blood, meaning they were not our compatriots. But even after apologizing again and again, I still get comments like these, supposedly saying that I'm lying to you and just manipulating you.
For Ilya, it's completely unclear how Sophia Augusta became Yekaterina the Great, what connection she has to the Russian throne, and on what grounds she ruled at all. The second question is, Why did Karl Peter Ulrich suddenly become Pyotr Fyodorovich III? Where did all these Fyodors come from, after whom our emperors and empresses were given their patronymics?
Well, you understand, the Tsar couldn't be Karl Peter Ulrich, but he could be Pyotr Fyodorovich. Although I've always had big questions about the patronymics. Why did Karl Peter Ulrich become Fyodorovich? Where did this Fyodor even come from, after whom our emperors and empresses were given their patronymics?
A third question, why, for example, did the first wife of Alexander II suddenly become Maria Alexandrovna, if by birth she was Augusta Sophia of Hesse and by Rhine?
Nicholas's wife is Alexandra Fyodorovna. Even though her father was Ludwig of Hesse, Alexander's wife is Maria Fyodorovna. Why? After all, her father is Christian, the king of Denmark. Maria Fyodorovna is the wife of Pavel Karlovich, whom for some reason we call Pavel Petrovich. So, his wife, Sofia Dorothea Augusta Luisa Württembergskaya, became Maria Fyodorovna, even though her father was Friedrich Eugen Württembergsky. Anna Fyodorovna is the wife of Konstantin Pavlovich, the brother of Alexander I, essentially the heir. Born as Princess Juliana Henrietta Ulrika Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeldskaya, she also somehow received the patronymic Fyodorovna, even though her father was Franz. Next is the wife of Nikolai, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, Princess Frederica Louise Charlotte Wilhelmina of Prussia. Her father was Friedrich Wilhelm, King of Prussia. So you see, Friedrichs, Francis, Christians, Ludwigs, and Karls were given the patronymic Fyodorovich.
There are plenty of such questions concerning our rulers. So I will choose these three questions, which have been directly voiced and emphasized by the chairman for a couple of years now, and I will try to find the simplest and most obvious answers to them. Actually, no, the simplest and most obvious answer has already been found by Ilya. In his opinion, this was done solely to blend in as one of their own.
And so, in order to come to power, they will call themselves whatever you like, just so it sounds sweet to your ears. Both Georgie the Victorious and Maria and Yekaterina, but these are wolves in sheep's clothing. Our people have shed too much blood to step on the same rake again and repeat their mistakes.
Well then, I'll offer less obvious answers, and at the same time, let's try to dig a little deeper into the topic and lift the veil of mystery, even in places where no alternative researcher has looked before. And by the end of the video, you'll understand for yourself how, for example, Ivan Grozny's helmet ended up in Sweden. So I won't keep you waiting any longer. Take a seat, we're starting. First of all, why am I absolutely not satisfied with the answer found by Ilya? Well, at the very least, because it doesn't explain anything. Why make things so complicated? How would such camouflage help? Didn't ordinary people know that the emperor's wife or the empress was a foreigner? Yes, of course they did. It was an open secret. Then why? Just to please the ear? Well, something like that. That doesn't explain anything either, since such behavior is a sign of fear of the people's power. But as we can see from history, there was no fear at all. Yekaterina, absolutely unafraid, simply took and drove most of the people into serfdom. So it's not as simple as Ilya in the official history presented to us. Secondly, like Ilya, I also believe that history has been rewritten and falsified many times. However, we must not underestimate the opponents of official historians, who are backed by libraries, foundations, and state politicians. To accuse them of making up history out of thin air, as each one pleases, without a clear, unified scheme, that is rather arrogant and foolish. So it's not that simple. But nevertheless, the explanation should still be simple and logical. So let's try to fit the Sova onto the globe. Let's start right away with the second question. It's the easiest one. Why did Karl Peter Ulrich suddenly become Pyotr Fyodorovich? Let's break down his true full name into parts. Part 1, Karl. Many researchers apparently don't realize that Karl is not actually a name, but a title meaning king. Suddenly, yes. But you don't have to look far. Well, quite recently, the Queen of the United Kingdom, Yelizaveta, passed away. Her place was taken by the Queen's son, Prince Charles, who was renamed Karl at the coronation. Some people say that his name, Charles, is pronounced as Karl and other such nonsense. However, why not just keep the previous name then? Why rename him? It's simply because that's not a name, it's a title. That's all. So, the first part of Piotr's name should be read as King Piotr Ulrich. That means he never lost or changed his name at all. He was Piotr at birth, and he remained Piotr when he ascended to the Russian throne. Now, the patronymic Fyodorovich, where did that come from? Well, that's not so complicated either. His father was Karl Friedrich Holstein Gottorp, so as we've already understood, not Karl, but the King of Gottorp, Friedrich, and the Russian equivalent of the name Friedrich is Fyodor, King Fyodor. And naturally, the son of King Fyodor should be called Fyodorovich. And the third part of the name is Ulrich. This is also not a name, but derived from the German Jüderlich, which means noble. So it turns out that Karl Peter Ulrich, the son of Karl Friedrich, is simply the noble king Peter Fyodorovich. So I don't see any contradiction here. It's strange that the chairman of the S&T didn't look into this topic a bit deeper. Let's move on to the next question. Why, for example, did Alexander's first wife suddenly become Maria Alexandrovna if she was born Augusta? Sophia Hessen and Prirenea? This one is a bit more complicated, and you'll need to pick a bigger owl for the globe. And once again, we start by analyzing the name she was given at birth. However, we already understand that such high-ranking individuals are not given names according to the standard rules. First name, last name, patronymic, meaning the algorithm of name, family, father. Here the algorithm is more complex. Title, name, clan, and the name of the governed territory. Perhaps something else as well. Let's go. So, her full name is Maximiliana Wilhelmina Augusta Sophia Maria of Hesse and by Rhine. Well, of Hesse and by Rhine is clear. That's just the name of her ancestral lands. But why are there 5 names at once? Maybe these aren't names at all, but something like titles. Let's try to translate these names into Russian. Maximiliana, translated from German, means the greatest. In some versions, it means messenger of God. Wilhelmina, translated from the German abbreviation of 2 words, will and helmet, roughly means protector. Augusta. Again, it's a translation, but this time from Latin, and it means great or sacred. And Sophia simply means wise. And then Maria is actually just a name. Put it all together and you get the greatest protector, sacred and wise Maria, ruler of Hessen and Pyrenees. Quite a worthy title. When she got married, she kept her real name, Maria. But where did Alexandrovna come from, huh? You can make up all sorts of things here, but let's not go too far and just take a look. The meaning of the word Alexander, surprisingly, is exactly the same as Wilhelmina, that is, defender or protectress. So in fact, the Empress kept her real name given to her at birth. She just translated it into Russian transcription. Nothing unusual, in my opinion. Everything matches up here as well. Now let's get to the most interesting part about our Empress Yekaterina the Great. We take her real name, Sophia Augusta Frederica Anhalt-Zerbst, translated into Russian, and we get wise, great ruler of Anhalt Serbs. Frederica in German actually means ruler. But actually, it turns out there's no real name here, just titles. Even her own mother, since childhood, called her Feig, which is short for the German version, meaning little Frederica, or to be precise, little ruler. It's possible that we simply don't know her real name given at birth, but otherwise there was no transformation or change at the coronation. Look, Sophia Augusta means wise and great. So as she was great at birth, she remained great at the coronation. As she was a ruler, she stayed a ruler. Nothing changed. Well, let's do it again. Here is her father, Christian August, her brother Friedrich August, and her grandfather, Iogan August. Does anyone still have any doubts that August simply means the great? And again, her name is Frederico, and her brother's is Frederick. It's as if their mother couldn't remember any other names, whether for a son or a daughter. Both are Frederic, and both are August, or maybe Frederick is still a ruler, so actually brother and sister, and both are great rulers, meaning Frederick August. But we don't know their real names. So the only mystery is, where did the name Yekaterina come from? Officially, it is claimed that she received this name when she converted to Orthodoxy in honor of Yekaterina. One sounds rather far-fetched unless you know the history. Yes, indeed, there is such a tradition of changing one's name when converting to Orthodoxy. However, what if before marriage or Orthodoxy, she didn't have a name at all? It sounds pretty wild and unexpected. However, there are already similar examples in history. This is, in fact, the Roman Empire in ancient Rome, or in other words, the First Reich. Women didn't have names, they only received a family name, indicating their clan, family, or a nickname. For example, Tertia means the third, or Secunda means the second, Julia from the Julian clan, and so on. And by the way, it was there, in ancient Roman traditions, that there was also a custom where girls had many names at once. It inevitably brings to mind an analogy with our own heroes. For example, Maximiliana, Wilhelmina, Augusta, Sophia, Maria. Here, both Latin and German names and traditions are mixed together, and ruling clans all over the world value traditions above all else. It's not surprising that the young Yekaterina simply might not have had a real name, and only when she converted to Orthodoxy did she receive one. So, I think I've answered the three main questions that have been bothering the chairman of the Sinti for the past couple of years. Using this method, you can decipher the names and surnames of all the other mysterious rulers of Russia. However, another question bothers me. Could it be that Ilya Gerasimov couldn't take just half a step further and uncover what I just told you? Does he really not know that Karl is not a name, but a title? No, he knows it perfectly well. Look, here he says directly that Basileus and Basili are actually titles and mean ruler in Latin.
Actually, Ioan Basileus, for some reason read here as Ivan Vasilievich, is in fact a Tsar. Ivan Basileus is a title, not a patronymic. And according to our history, for almost 100 years, either Ivans or Vasilis ruled, and I think we'll still have to figure this out. And that same Ivan III the Great could very well have been the Terrible, just as Ivan the Terrible could have been the Great.
It's exactly the same story with the Karls, but for some reason, many people prefer to ignore it and not notice. I think the situation with the rulers' names has become more or less clear, but no matter what the names are, these are still foreign rulers, not ours, not our own, right? After all, that's exactly the idea that Ilya is trying to instill in us.
When our Empress Yekaterina the Great, Yekaterina II, is called Sophia Augusta Frederica Anhalt-Zerbst. And by saying this, I'm implying that our emperors were not Russian by blood, meaning they were not our compatriots.
So let's figure this out here as well, shall we? In one of my videos, I put forward the hypothesis that Pyotr might not have existed at all. However, for now, let's temporarily set this idea aside and look at the events that took place back then, relying specifically on the official version. So let's get started. We'll begin from the very beginning and go all the way to Yekaterina II and how she ended up on the Russian throne. And here again, we'll use the questions that Ilya asks first of all. Ilya doesn't understand how it happened that right after his death, a woman of humble origins, the wife of Pyotr I, Yekaterina I, ended up on the throne.
Somehow, a woman of humble origins, Marta Samuilovna Skavronskaya, also known as Yekaterina I, ends up on the throne.
Let's not get into how she turned from Marta Skavronskaya into Yekaterina right now. The instructions are just above. Instead, let's think about why her specifically. Well, actually, what's there to think about? Pyotr didn't leave any male heirs, so the question of succession suddenly became urgent. But see for yourself. Out of Pyotr's 8 children, only 2 were male, and both died while Pyotr was still alive. There were 6 daughters left, of whom only 3 were still alive at the time of Pyotr I's death. So, we need to look at what happened with the children of Pyotr I's brother Ivan. He also had 5 princess daughters, of whom 3 were still alive at that time. So, if we strictly follow the ancient tradition of succession to the throne, the choice would be only among women. 3 daughters of Pyotr, 3 daughters of Ivan, and Pyotr's wife. But she was completely of humble origin, Marta Skavronskaya. So, 7 women in total. Let's remember this moment well. From both legitimate stars, Pyotr and Ivan, only female heirs survived. Plus 1 underage grandson of Pyotr, born from his son Alexei Petrovich and Charlotta Kristina Sofia Braunschweig Wolfenbüttelskaya. That is a direct male line descendant. He was supposed to become the next emperor. But at that time, he was only 9 years old, and he needed a regent to rule on his behalf until he came of age. In turn, the regent would gain enormous power during this period and could easily deprive others of it. Comparing it to what's happening now, we can confidently assume that the arguments were heated and intense. The forces that claimed power were serious. Therefore, most likely, it was decided collectively to write a decree retroactively, supposedly on behalf of Pyotr, which allowed the emperor to appoint any successor at his own discretion. In any case, I don't believe in coincidence. Where a person who has dreamed of more and more power all his life, who proclaimed himself emperor, suddenly decides at the peak of his glory and power to give his authority to someone else, and then suddenly dies shortly after. Well, the story of Peter himself was first told to us by someone named Golikov Ivan Ivanovich, under the dictation of Miller himself. And this is not my imagination, but the words of Golikov himself. I already quoted them in detail in the video, Encrypted Peter. Here's a little reminder for you again. However, Ilya Presidatel, for some reason, stubbornly avoids analyzing the very first source about Peter in Russian and reads more recent editions. And that's probably why he simply overlooked this fact. Thus, by adopting a forged document about the elective succession to the throne, the claimant's hands were untied. However, everyone understood that as soon as one of them took the throne, the others would immediately deprive him of his life and power, since none of the rest would accept it. That is why the best solution was, instead of appointing a regent, to put in place a well-controlled, fully legitimate but powerless figure. And that person was, in fact, Peter's widow. An important precedent was set. Of course, this is just my guess, but such a scenario is more than likely. Roughly speaking, it is the most logical of all possible options. However, as always happens, A puppet ruler is just a figure being pulled in different directions by various forces without their own will or power. Just feasting day after day won't last long. So it's not surprising that she died just 2 years later. Once again, the question of succession to the throne arose. No other option remained. Pyotr was the only legitimate successor. There was no way around it. They had to crown either him or one of the princesses. Obviously, if they crowned a princess, all the power would slip out of the hands of the secret council. But if they crowned Pyotr II, then when he turned 16, he could, out of revenge, destroy everyone who executed his father. That is, the members of the secret council themselves. However, there were still more than 4 years to go before that moment. And so the choice was obvious again, to crown Pyotr on the condition that he promised not to take revenge on anyone who had signed the death sentence for his father Alexei. By the way, it was actually Menshikov who insisted that power be transferred to Pyotr. And as we remember, it was Menshikov himself who signed the death sentence for Pyotr's father, Alexei. You could say that Menshikov was covering himself this way. And by the way, he paid each of the princesses, Anna and Elizaveta, 1,000,000 rubles so that they wouldn't interfere with this. So everyone was satisfied. The secret council retained power for another 4 years. The princesses had money, and the legitimacy of power and succession was clearly maintained. Did you notice? So far, no Holstein-Gottorps, no Oldenburgs. Everything is strictly along the male line. Although no, Ilya for some reason believes that Peter, the grandson born from Peter's son Alexei, is a pure descendant along the male line. This is the arrival of the Brunswick dynasty, based solely on the fact that his wife was from the Brunswick dynasty.
So look at what happens. After the death of Peter and his laundress Ekaterina, the Brunswick dynasty comes to the throne in the person of Peter Alexeyevich, Peter II. He is the son of Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich, the son of Peter I, and the German princess Sofia Charlotta Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttelskaya.
So according to Ilya, blood is passed down through the female line. But that's not the case. A bit later, he says that Peter is already from the Holstein-Gottorp dynasty, on the grounds that this time his father is from the Holstein-Gottorp dynasty.
And on the other side, the Holstein-Gottorps. I'll immediately point out the opposition. I just spoke about Peter III, Karl Peter Ulrich Holstein-Gottorp. He appears precisely in the marriage of Anna Petrovna, the daughter of Peter I and Catherine, and Karl Friedrich Holstein-Gottorp.
What was that, Ilya? So in your opinion, through which line is the blood passed down? Through the male or female line? But apparently, Ilya, it doesn't matter which one. The main thing is to subtly manipulate the listeners' minds and create the impression that outsiders are ruling us from all sides.
And by saying that, I'm implying that our emperors were not Russian by blood, meaning they were not our compatriots.
But time went on relentlessly. Peter's 16th birthday was approaching, and once again, behind-the-scenes scheming emerged from under the table. The Ostermans showed Peter documents about his father's execution, signed by Menshikov, and that's basically how they brought him down. The Dolgorikovs, in turn, pushed the Ostermans aside and decided to marry Peter to Princess Ekaterina Dolgorikova. However, 2 weeks before the wedding, on January 17th, the Ostermans and Minich urgently needed to hold a parade on the Moscow River in the harshest, bitter cold. As a result, for some reason, Peter caught smallpox and died exactly on the night before his wedding. At this point, Peter's male line ended completely, but the female line remained. By the way, about smallpox and the cold, why didn't Peter just catch a cold? Where did smallpox come from? Of course, all of this is just conspiracy theory. But remembering how some colonizers of America gave Native Americans blankets infected with smallpox, after which they quickly died, and also recalling the severe frost during the parade, it seems quite logical that Astermans and Menix, sensing their imminent loss of power, could have offered the boy to warm himself with a similar blanket. So, in our deck of cards, there are only 4 direct descendants of the ruling dynasty left. 1 Tsarevna from Pyotr and 3 Tsarevnas from Ivan. There's not much room for imagination here. If someone says that someone else should have been appointed, that's just manipulation. Even the Privy Council, although it adopted a fake decree from Pyotr for such a case about the free transfer of power to anyone he wished, still couldn't fully take advantage of it. The people also know the rules, and nobody needs unnecessary uprisings. That's why you have to play with the cards you have. So who is the next contender in that case? The choice isn't great again, frankly. It should be the eldest of the surviving children of Pyotr or his brother Ivan. That turned out to be Ivan's daughter, Anna Ioannovna. By that time, she was already 37 years old. She takes the throne. I'll repeat once again, even though she is a woman, she is still a direct heir of the Romanov house. Moreover, even though she entered into a dynastic marriage with the Duke of Courland, that marriage lasted less than 3 months. They had no children, and the Duke himself died very quickly at the age of 18. By the time of Anna's coronation, she had already been a widow for almost 20 years, so there was still a direct line of succession. Moreover, as a result of this marriage, Courland, which is modern-day Latvia, came under Russian rule. But this is exactly where the height of behind-the-scenes games begins. During the 20 years she spent in Courland, it seems that Anna was deeply influenced by the local environment and decided to leave the throne to the first male heir of her niece, that is, the first son of her sister's daughter. Things aren't straightforward here either, since the only witnesses to the signing of this will were Asterman and Byron, whom we already know. By the way, an interesting fact. Another sister of Anna Ioannovna, Praskovia Ioannovna, managed to avoid Peter I's wish to marry off all daughters to Germans and secretly marry General-in-Chief Mamonov. From the Rurik dynasty, they had a son, and by 1730 he was already 6 years old. Sooner or later, he would have become the main contender for the throne, since he had the blood of both the Rurikids and the Romanovs. However, about a month after the coronation of Anna Ivanovna, his father was riding in a carriage with the Empress, and there in the carriage, he suddenly passed away. After him, his 6-year-old son died, and a year later, his mother as well. Someone was clearly eliminating all possible male heirs, as well as those from whom they could descend. So, in October of 1840, Empress Anna sat down to dinner with Baron, and she suddenly had a seizure. 11 days later, she died. A new ruler had to be chosen, and the list of heirs was getting shorter and shorter. There were no children of Tsar Ivan left, and among Peter's children, only Elizaveta remained. It would seem the choice was obvious. Besides Elizaveta, by seniority, no one else had the right to the throne at all. However, Baron and Osterman still decided to play the card of an appointed heir to the throne and promoted the infant Ivan to the throne, whose degree of kinship was as follows. Ivan's daughter, Ekaterina Ivanovna, Anna's sister, married Karl Leopold of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, or, as we now understand, King Leopold. She gave birth to a daughter, Anna Leopoldovna, from him. Once again, note, not Karlovna, but specifically Leopoldovna, which once again emphasizes the correctness of our conclusions. And so she, after marrying Anton Ulrich of Brunswick, gave birth to a son. Thus, the infant Ivan was only a quarter Romanov, and the remaining 75% were Mecklenburg and Brunswick. Moreover, it was because of his birth that Empress Anna died. She was simply killed by Osterman and Byron. Do you doubt it? Then try to explain in some other way the fact that the Empress died after signing the decree appointing her nephew as emperor, if he was male. And exactly on the day of his birth, she suddenly dies. That day she was in St. Petersburg, and Ivan was born there as well. In other words, as soon as it became known that a boy was born, Anna was killed that same day. But it's easy to understand why Baron and Esterman would do this. They got used to it over the 15 years after Pyotr's death. To power, to money, to the opportunity to plunder the treasury and fill their own pockets. And if a son was born, they would have at least 16 more years of such cloudless rule ahead of them. But they clearly didn't know their opponent well. To give the throne to an infant who was only a quarter Romanov, while the emperor's own daughter, a full-blooded Romanov, was still alive. No, I don't even know what they were counting on. Literally a year later, the last surviving direct heir of Peter, Elizaveta, simply walked into the Preobrazhensky barracks, into the Grenadier Company and asked, "Soldiers, do you know who I am?" The soldiers replied, "Mother Tsesarevna, we know you well. For you will endure anything." After these words, everyone moved toward the Winter Palace. Not a single person, not a single guard offered any resistance. I hope it's clear why now. Because absolutely everyone understood who the only legitimate heir and ruler really was. After that, the entire Braunschweig family and its supporters were arrested, was imprisoned in a fortress, and Sturman, Minnek, and Levenvold were sentenced to death, which, however, was replaced by exile to Siberia. That's roughly how Ivan ended up in prison. And he wasn't any real heir, as Ilya thinks. Just a distant relative, not an heir. Just a puppet so that others could live comfortably through him for the next 16 years. And any other ruler in Elizabeth's place would have executed everyone. However, throughout her life, Elizabeth never once used the death penalty. However, Ilya is trying to manipulate things here as well. In his opinion, Ivan was imprisoned not because he was a puppet without sufficient rights to the throne, but because otherwise the Mecklenburg-Brunswick dynasty could have taken the throne.
So, they locked him away and didn't let him come to power because the Mecklenburg-Brunswick dynasty could have taken the throne.
Wait. Ilya, who do you think the Braunschweigs are? That's Elizaveta Braunschweig. Actually, she's 100% Peter's daughter, and after coming to power, she was the one who arrested the Braunschweig family. Now we've come to the most delicate moment. How did Ekaterina end up on the throne? So, in 1762, as a result of an unidentified illness that caused throat bleeding, Empress Elizaveta passed away. The question of succession to the throne arose once again. All direct descendants were gone, so it was time to turn to the second generation, grandsons and granddaughters. And once again, the deck of Peter's heirs begins to be shuffled. First and foremost, his daughters, whom he himself married off, and one of whom eventually had a son. His father was Karl Friedrich Holstein Gottorp, which, as we now understand, translated into Russian, means King Fyodor Holstein Gottorp. 50% Romanov blood is definitely better than 25%. So once again, Ivan was unlucky. He remained imprisoned, while Pyotr Ulrich Fyodorovich, who had long been living in St. Petersburg with his wife by that time, was crowned to the throne. However, he was not destined to live even until the coronation. Only half a year had passed since the death of Elisaveta, and he had already been overthrown and killed. Now we are told that he was removed because he had an affection for the Germans. But as you will understand a little later, at that time this was hardly a serious reason for removal. And his father Fyodor was actually from Peter's close circle, and even at the early stages was a member of the secret council. The main thing is that, firstly, if he had really been removed by a dissatisfied people or nobility, then the circumstances of his death would not still be hidden. And secondly, Catherine's subsequent actions. Her active correspondence with Voltaire and the huge number of loans, which she clearly did not intend to repay and which looked more like payments, may hint at the true mastermind behind the murder of Peter III. This was the conspirators' finest hour. They decided not to come up with anything new and used a plan that had already worked once before. That is, they left the emperor's wife on the throne, just like they did with Pyotr. So, here is the first case of the Oldenburg dynasty ruling Russia. It would seem that's it. From then on, all the rulers were exclusively foreigners. This is exactly what our alternative theorists and alarmists take advantage of, claiming that someone has taken us over and we are now a colony. However, this story has a continuation that many try to avoid or don't bother to dig any deeper into. But we won't stop there, will we? So, first of all, after the death of Yekaterina, Pavel took the throne. He was the legitimate son in marriage, and although not a direct descendant, only a quarter, he was still the heir of Pyotr. In any case, the chairman of the SNT considers Ivan the legitimate heir, even calling him a great martyr. So how is Pavel any worse? His degree of kinship with Peter is exactly the same, if not better. And then his children, Alexander, Nikolai, and their children ascended to the throne. We all know that already. However, during our investigation, new unexpected mysteries have emerged. Look, Pyotr I deliberately married off his daughters into dynastic unions, specifically with the Oldenburgs, namely the Holstein-Gottorps. Why? No, seriously, why them specifically? What's with the special fondness for Scandinavians and Germans? Why not the French? Why not the British? Why not the Turkish Sultan or the Spanish crown? Yeah, weren't there plenty of great dynasties around at that time? Yeah, there were so many you couldn't spit without hitting a king or a duke. Nevertheless, it was Prussia, Sweden, and Denmark specifically. But what's so special about a trading company, my merchant friends? That's kind of beneath an emperor, don't you think? He had plenty of his own merchants, and besides, the Ostend Company actually depended on the route through Russia. You don't usually form close ties with those who depend on you. And King Fyodor Karl Friedrich, whom Pyotr married his daughter Anna Petrovna to, was actually deprived of his lands in Sweden by his own Holstein-Gottorp family. And his possessions in Holstein were taken away from him as well, and he gave up his right to claim the Russian throne himself. In short, he wasn't a representative of a powerful dynasty, as we are told, but rather a poor relative at Pyotr's court. Nevertheless, Pyotr became related to him. One thing's for sure, you shouldn't consider Pyotr I an idiot. So, what was his benefit for which he married off all his daughters in dynastic marriages specifically to the Oldenburgs, Mecklenburg, Schwerins, and Courlanders? Let's look at the map to see where these lands are located. They line up neatly in a single line along the Baltic Sea from modern-day Latvia to Denmark. In other words, Peter planned to annex all these territories to the Russian Empire, at the very least, but not by military means, rather peacefully. In any case, this plan becomes clearly visible. Why? What's so special about these lands? Let's recall the very beginning of Pyotr's reign, or rather, not his reign itself, but one very well-known event that happened at that time. This is an event that every self-respecting alternate historian has mentioned more than once, including myself, the chairman, and really everyone. However, for some reason, the connection slips away. I'm talking about the death of the Swedish king Karl I, the famous leaflet with the mournful speech written in Latin script in pure Russian language. Literally everyone who has seen and read it even once understands that, judging by the leaflet, the Swedes at that time were actually speaking Russian. And the relations between our countries at that time were more than brotherly. The war started later, when Karl came to the throne. In addition to this, we can recall the archaeological excavations in Germany, where almost every burial has Slavic roots and the Slavic language. And now let's try once again to read the numerous names of rulers of that time. Karl Friedrich Wilhelm Kurlansky, that is the ruler-protector Kurlansky. Karl Leopold Mecklenburg-Schwerin, that is King Lev of Mecklenburg, Karl. That is the sixth king Christian August Angeld-Serbsky, meaning the great Christian Angeld-Serbsky. Another one is Karl Friedrich Holstein-Gottorpsky, that is the king ruler Holstein-Gottorpsky, and so on. All Karls, that is kings Friedrichs, that is rulers Augusts, that is great Wilhelms, that is defenders. Nothing but titles, but not a single name. Don't you find this, to put it mildly, strange? In other words, if you read the history of Europe from that time, you won't find a single name, only distorted titles that are presented to us as names. But after all, there have already been repeated suggestions that earlier, before the catastrophe, all of Europe spoke one language, Russian. From Italy with its Etruscans to Germany and Prussia, from Thrace to Sweden. However, something happened that caused the empire to fall apart, and each part became a separate state. And over time, it came up with its own language and customs. It's hard to believe. Fantastic. Yes, we literally saw exactly the same thing just 30 years ago. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the former Russian Empire, collapsed, and each part became a separate state and came up with its own language. Or, for example, Kazakhstan, just like Sweden in the 18th century, first introduced the Latin alphabet, and Ukraine came up with its own language and suddenly decided that we are enemies. And so on and so on. And in another 20 years, the next generation of historians will seriously think that for the last 70 years, Russia was ruled by foreigners. No, seriously, Khrushchev was Ukrainian, Brezhnev was Ukrainian, Stalin was Georgian. We lived under the oppression of Ukrainians. Of course not. However, such an impression is inevitably formed. Just like now, many bloggers believe that we were conquered by the Germans and that they wrote our history as well. Well, by the way, they really did write the history. But at the same time, the writers have specific names: Miller, Schlesser, Bayer, Baron, Osterman, Minnick, and so on. They wrote not only with the pen, but also with the sword, removing all unwanted names from history, in fact, all names, leaving only titles. Do you think this isn't happening now? Then ask your children how their peers will remember them. By their names? No, by nicknames, by titles, by online usernames. Okay, names are more or less clear, but what about territory? Why did Pyotr want to annex exactly these territories and exactly these clans? My videos from the Invisible Apocalypse series will help you with this, so especially the first 6 films. They show quite clearly how shockwaves were distributed across the earth and which areas remained more or less untouched. These very areas coincide with the centers of development of modern civilization at its beginning. And one of the best preserved areas is precisely the Baltic coast in Scandinavia. They were reliably protected by rocks. So it was there that people began to recover the fastest. Actually, the name of the Renaissance era directly tells us about this. And it makes sense that the first thing the surviving members of the ancient civilization should do is to centralize power in their own hands and also eliminate any possibility of disobedience, to start building new cities. By the way, have you ever wondered if there are so many different Novgorods, new cities, on the planet, then where are the old ones? If you search for Stargorod on the internet, you'll find some village in the Lviv region and a couple of stories where this city appears as a fictional place. Strange, isn't it? However, such a city does exist. It still exists to this day. It's called Stargorod, that is Oldenburg in Germany. Do you think I'm stretching the truth? Then take a look at the map. Here is Germany and the city of Oldenburg, Stargorod. And just a little further to the east, suddenly the center of medieval trade, the homeland of all trading dynasties, the city of Lübeck. But the main thing, and this is not even hidden, the name Lübeck is not German at all, but Slavic, and it actually means to love, a favorite activity, a beloved city. Pretty cool, right? Right in the center of the Holstein province, under the authority of Oldenburg, that is Stargorod, there is the Russian trading city of Lübeck. Not much. Let's go further east. A little farther away, there's another Russian city, Rostock. There's no need to even say what it means. It's probably one of the first post-catastrophe cities founded by survivors, and again, by Slavs. Still not much. Let's go a little further east. See this island here? It's called Rügen. That's its current name. And the official history tells us that the name comes from the Rugi tribe, or Rugi, and its earlier name was Ruyan. But that's deceptive. In reality, this is our Russian island, which was described by Pushkin as Buyan, yes, the very same magical island of Buyan, where the remains of the Slavic temple Arkona still exist to this day, and according to some sources, it was the temple of the god Sviatovid. Why look any further? The last Russian settlements on this island survived all the way until Hitler, and he was the one who destroyed them. And all of this happened right on the very piece of land occupied by the estates of the Oldenburgs, Schleswig-Holsteins, Holstein-Gottorps, and Mecklenburgs. That is on the territory of Prussia in western Pomerania. By the way, Prussia, I don't know where the letter P came from, but basically it's literally the lands of Russia. Actually, I don't know why. It's pretty simple. This is Pomerania, so the letter P means Pomeranian Russia or Pomorussia. And yes, the word Pomerania is considered a distorted version of the word Pomeria, again from the Old Slavic language. But maybe it's not Pomeray, but actually a place where many people died, Pomerania. But that could just be my guess. So let's sum up the disappointing results. It turns out that Pyotr deliberately sought to reunite the ancient Russian lands, which stretched not only to the east, but also far to the west. He wanted to become related to the older antediluvian families and restore the empire. Perhaps this is exactly what caused his affection for the Germans, the Oldenburgs, and the Gottorps. Perhaps that's why he went there to study, to learn what remained of the former civilization. And once we were a single people, just as we were one people with Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and so on. However, some people have different plans about this. And this someone skillfully manipulates people through greed and the desire for power, and does everything possible to throw a wrench in the works. They gave us Karls instead of kings, Oldenburgs instead of the old city folk, Fredericks instead of rulers, Augusts instead of the great ones, and their real names have been lost to history. As they say, it's the curse of memory. And now bloggers chasing YouTube money are shouting everywhere that we were ruled by foreign Germans. Just like soon, they'll start shouting that we were ruled by foreign Ukrainians and Georgians in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
And by saying that, they're claiming our emperors weren't Russian by blood, meaning they weren't our compatriots.
But it turns out that at that time, all those dynasties and lands were actually our compatriots, who ended up cut off from us as a result of a catastrophe. Pretty much the same way as Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and earlier, Poland and Finland. And just like now, some, like Pyotr, are trying to restore the empire, while others resort to all sorts of tricks to sow discord among a united people and prevent them from coming together again. Whether intentionally or not, in this way, they sow seeds of hatred among the people toward Germans, Ukrainians, and people of other nationalities in general. They are playing right into the hands of the parasites, preventing people from uniting. In reality, thieves and parasites have always existed and still exist in every government. You shouldn't blame the Germans for the actions of certain individuals who got addicted to the drug of power. They are simply parasites, and there are plenty of them even now. Parasites who, just to fill their own bellies, are capable of killing infants, emperors, their fathers and mothers, and poisoning empresses. They have no nationality. However, what if our real enemy isn't even human, and he doesn't care about nations at all? Fellow bloggers, be careful when declaring a nation as the enemy or labeling certain families as invaders. That's exactly how fascism is born. That's how memory is erased, with blood, with victims. And you will get your 30 pieces of silver for betraying the human race. Subtitles created by